So we're on Daf Ches, and we're trying to figure out how do we know that all the avodos require, let's say, for example, in the case of a chatos, that the avodos be done l'shem chatos. Ashkachan Shchita v'Kabbalah, the Gemara had already established on Daf Zayin and Beis that we have good sources for two out of the four avodos, namely Shchita and Kabbalah, in the case of a chatos, that when the Kohen does the Shechita of the Chatos and receives the dam in a mizrak, in a receptacle, he has to have in mind that he's performing these avodos for the sake of a Chatos. But Zrika Minayin, how do we know that even in the case of Zrika, you have to do the Zrika of the Chatos, L'Shem Chatos? Maybe once you've done the Shechita and the Kabbalah Saddam, that's sufficient. And the Gemara says, the Omar Kra, V'chiper olav hakohen michataso. Now the word v'chiper refers to the kapara, and the dam, the zrikas adam, is the mechaper shetehei kapara l'shem chatos. The Gemara says ashkan shinui kodesh. Now we know that you're not allowed to change the nature of the korban, meaning have in mind instead of a chatos, have in mind shlomim. But Shini Bailim Minolan, what's the source for the fact that the Kohen is required to have in mind the Bailim, the one who designated the korban is bringing the korban for his kapara, not somebody else? Omakra Olav, because the pasuk says V'chiper Olav. Olav means for him. Olav Valal Chaver, but not for his friend. Ashkan LeMitzvah, but Liakiv Minolan. Okay, you found many sources to prove that the Kohen is obligated to perform the chatos, all its avodos, for the sake of Kodesh, for the sake of chatos, and for the sake of the Bailim. But how do you know that if, let's say, the Kohen had a machshavas shelo l'shem chatos, but rather l'shem ola, or l'shem shlomim, or he didn't have in mind this Bailim, he had in mind somebody else, how do you know that it's ma'akev the korban is possible? Because that's what the Mishnah at the beginning of Maseches Zevachim establishes, that chatos is different than any other korban in the fact that machshavas shelo lishma passes the korban. And the Gemara answers Kira Omer of Huna Bered Rabbi Yeshua. It says chatos chatoso. In other words, it could have said chatos, and instead it says chatoso. And that pasuk appears in the parish of a Navi, of a Nazir, who has to bring many korbanos, one of which is a chatos. And the Torah is telling you that the chatos of a Nazir is only kosher if it was offered, meaning all its four avodos for the sake of the Nazir. Hochenami chatos chatoso. So not only in the case of a Nazir, but in the case of any classic chatos, you have to have in mind l'shem chatos and l'shem the bailim. If you don't have that in mind, but you have machshavas shelo lishma, then it passes the korban. So the Gemara says now, Ashkan mitzvah b'shinui kodesh. Okay, you're talking about the fact that the Torah requires that the avodah has to be l'shem chatos, and if you had in mind a different korban, then it passes the chatos, and that's as far as shinui kodesh. But zrika b'shinui bailim, bein lemitzvah bein liakev minol. How do we know that when it comes to shinui bailim, because that's not included in the pasuk of chatos, how do we know that if the zrika of the dam was done not for the sake of Ruvain the Bala korban, but the zrika was done for the sake of Shimon, another person? How do we know that that disqualifies the korban and it's possible? And the Gemara answers that li'akev b'chol avodos b'shinui kodesh u'b'shar avodos b'shinui bailim bein lemitzvah bein li'akev. So we're not sure. We already established that a shinui kodesh, which means chatos l'shem shlomim, etc., would passel the korban b'diavad. We know that with regard to, let's say, the avoda of shchita and kabbalah, we need that the korban be brought, I mean to say the shchita be done and the kabbalah sadam for the sake of the owner of the korban who's bringing the korban. But how do we know that that halacha of shini bailin that passes the carbon in the case of chatos would apply also to zrika. After all, we only have a source for shchita and kabbalah minolan Omar Rabbi Yonah asya mechatas nozir. Let's take a look at the parsha of chatas nozir. The Chsiv, it says in the parsha of Hikra v'Kohen l'fnei Hashem the osas chatoso v'es al oloso, and the Torah uses the possessive chatoso oloso, right? Because the Nazir brings both korbanos when he finishes his Nazirus, and he's matir himself in tiglachas and yayin and tumah. That's only after he brings both a chatos and an olah. And how do we know when it says es chatos and osoloso that it has to be for him and specifically for him? And how do we know that that applies to all avodos? Because the word v'asa is a klal. A klal means it's all encompassing. Sheyu kol asiyosov, whatever asiyah is necessary in the avodas hakarban, which means not just shchita and kabbalah, but also holacha and hazoya, meaning zrika sadam. L'shem chatos, it has to be for the sake of a chatos. Okay, fine. So you've expanded the halacha of l'shem chatos based on the parsha of Nazir to include all the avodos, but you still haven't answered my question. Ashkan shinui kodesh shinui bailu minolan. How do we know that this halacha, that a shinui kodesh, if you had in mind not l'shem chatos but l'shem a different carbon, it passes the carbon? How do we know that that same halacha applies for the avodos if he has in mind the wrong bailim, a different bailim, instead of Ruvain yas Shimon, Omer Rav Huna, Brei Rabbi Yeshuda, chatos chatosa. Right, in the parsha of Nazir, it says not just chatos, but it says chatoso, as we pointed out before, in the possessive. And chatoso tells me that all the avodas of the chatos have to be implemented for the sake of this Nazir, who's the bailim over the karma. The Gemara objects, maskif lo ravina, Elameyato, why don't we apply the same yardstick to a carbon ola? Because in the case of a carbon ola, likewise the Torah uses the possessive form ola so. And my darishbe, if you're going to be consistent about it, then the ola so should tell me that if the Kohen was makriv the ola, not for the sake of the bailim, but for someone else, it should passel the carbon. And that's not so. In chatos it passels the carbon. In Carbon Pesach, it passes the carbon, but not in Ola or Shlomim. So therefore, if Ruvain brought a carbon Ola, and the Kohen had in mind that that Ola should be for the sake of Shimon, the carbon is kosher. It says Ola so. Why aren't you consistent in applying the same principle that you applied to interpret Chatas so to Ola so? Now, at this point, the Gemara takes a kind of digression, because the Gemara doesn't think that Ravina's question is justified, because Ula Ravina, if Ravina is saying that we always have to be consistent, and whenever the Torah uses the word in the possessive form, we have to derive conclusions from it, then minchaso, the Torah doesn't say that you bring a mincha, it says minchaso, or nesech, that's the niskei yayin, it says nisko, and the carbon mincha and its nesachim would accompany these karbonos, and the pasuk says v'yosa koines minchaso v'es nisko, and this is referring to the ayal of El Nazir, which, by the way, could be brought even the next night. But in any event, that's not relevant to us right now. It just, the Gemara wants to say that shall Ravina be bothered by the same question, that if the Ayal HaNazir, the El Nazir, and its Mincha and its Nesachim were not brought for the sake of this particular Nazir, then the carbon becomes possible, and which would mean that he would have to repeat the mincha and the nesachim again. No, says Ravina, I don't have a problem with the word mincha so. because I need that for something else. I have a problem with olaso, but hahu, in the case of minchaso, mi boile, I require it, minchasom v'niskeim balayla. Now, what that means is that the Nazir brings his carbon during the day, and yet, even though the day ended, his mincha and his niskei ayayim, which are accompanying the carbon, can be brought even after nightfall. And that means that he gets another night. But not only that, minchasom and niskeiim is another ribui, afilu machar. We give him even the next day. So it's very strange that you could bring a mincha or niskei yayin at night and even the next day. At night is a bit of a chiddush because we usually say that the Beis Hamikdash is closed for business with nightfall, except for what's called haktoras eivarim ve'murim. But now we're adding mincha and nisachim, and I believe that that applies even beyond El Nazir, even to certain karbanos musaf as well, that have to be accompanied by menachos and nesachim. Even though the hakrov is done by day, the menachos and the nesachim can be brought the following night and even the day beyond that night. And that we see with regard to El Nazir, and we're going to apply the same principle to karbanos musaf. Now we go back to the Gemara and the question that was raised on Ravina, olaso, my darshbe. We don't know of any conclusion that we could draw from the possessive of the word olaso. Ola is not going to be accompanied by nesachim and menachos. Besu, and furthermore, we have another objection to Ravina, mi gamri me'adadi. Are you able to determine the laws of a chatos from the El Nazir? And chatos chelev mechatos nazir lo gomra, we have a unique case of chatos of a nazir, which is very chamur because it's accompanied by other karbanos like the ola. How can you derive conclusions about a chatos chelev, which is a classic chatos for a shogeg on an Iser kares like chelev? How can you derive that from El Nazir? Sheken yesh ima dvarim acherim. In the case of the chatos of a Nazir, it has to be accompanied by an ola and a shlomim. It's a threefold carbon episode. So therefore, those mitzvahs and chumras that would apply to an El Nazir cannot be derived. You can't extend it and objectify it for other karbanos of chatos. Chatos nazir michatos chelev lo gomer shekein kares. And not only that, you can't do it the other way around either. If you want to derive a chatos of a nazir from chatos chelev, that also you can't derive because in the case of a nazir, he didn't violate any Iser kares. In the case of chelev, he brings a chatos for an Iser kares. So therefore, we're left stuck holding the bag at this point, as we don't know how to derive one type of chatos from another type of chatos. Each one has its own chumrah, and dinim that apply to one cannot be applied to the other by this derivation, and therefore we need special limudim and yalfusos with regard to each separate category of a chatos. Ela marava asya michatos mitzora. And right now the Gemara thinks that chatos mitzora, which the mitzora brings at the termination of his saras in order to achieve tara, has a pretty much low profile, meaning it's not lechumra. There are no special chumras in tzaras. And yet the Torah says with regard to the chatos that the mitzora brings, the asa hakohen es hachatos. And again, whenever we see the word asa, it refers to all four avodos. And whenever we see es hachatos with the hey yediyah, it means for the sake of a chatos. Shiu kol chas yosef l'shem chatos. That all its avodos should be done for the sake of a chatos. And if it was brought for the sake of a different carbon, which is called shini kodesh, then the chatos is possible. Now, we already have derived that in the case of a regular classic chatos chelev, there's at the very least, a mitzvah to bring the chatos with the mindset of l'shem chatos. In the case of the chatos of the mitzorah, it would be totally unnecessary for the Torah to tell me a mitzvah, because we know that l'shem chatos is a requirement in every chatos as a mitzvah, and that mitzvah would apply to chatos of a mitzorah as well. So why did the Torah have to add these words of v'yosa kohen es hachatos in the case of mitzorah? It must be coming to tell me that if the chatos was done not for the sake of a mitzorah but for another purpose, which is shini kodesh, then it's possible. It disqualifies the carbon. So the Gemara once again says, Ashkan shini kodesh shini bailam minolan, but you still haven't proven to me that in the case of a chatos, if you have the wrong owner in mind, and we had a sugi a few days ago about if the other owner is also chayiv in a chatos, if that would make any difference, the sugi of Rava. But in any event, as a general rule, if let's say you had a chatos, not l'shem Ruvain, but you had in mind l'shem Shimon, then the carbon would be possible. How do we know that? We only have derived the absolute requirement of the unconditional requirement of chatos with regard to l'shem kodesh, but not l'shem bailim. Omar krav v'chipar ala mitaher. Excuse me. We're going back to the parasha Mitzorah once more and looking it over again. And the Torah add two words when it speaks about the chatos of a Mitzorah, and it says, al ha-mitaher. Mitaher means the one who is undergoing tara. Al ha-mitaher zev v'lo al-mitaher chaver. The Torah adds these words to exclude having in mind that the chatos Mitzorah should be brought on behalf of a different Mitzorah. So the tara of this mitzorah is what the Kohen has to have in mind as an absolute rule. Frekti Gemara once again, mitzorah has a chumrah that we don't have in a regular classic chatos. V'akati b'yalfa b'yadodi. How can you derive one chatos from another? Chatos chelev michatos mitzorah l'yalfa shkein yeshi mod domim acherim. The mitzorah has to bring with him and accompany his chatos an asham and an ola, a triple header. That's a chumrah in the chatos of a mitzorah. Now, if you want to flip it out the other way around, and let's say we'll derive chatos mitzorah from chatos chelev, that we can't do lo gomra because the chumrah of a regular classic chatos for eating chelev is because he violated an isur kares. That's not so in the case of a mitzorah who's coming to be mitayr himself. So at the end of the day, we have no proof that one or the other of these categories of chatos, whether it be a classic chatos, whether it be the chatos of mitzorah, is going to be disqualified and completely possible if you didn't have the right intention. And therefore, since it's not possible to derive these laws of passing the carbon with the wrong kavana and the wrong lishma, so the Gemara now, maybe we could say that will apply a tzad hashaveh. And the tzad hashaveh will be derived in the following way. Mechad lo asya. If we want to take one category of chatos, whether it be the chatos mitzorah, whether it be a chatos chelev, whether it be a chatos of a nazir, we want to learn that one from another one, is teisi chadamitarte. We can't learn one from one because we always have a chumrah in one that we don't have in the other, but let's join together forces and derive one of the chatos from the other two. And then you'll have what's called an eino inyan. So the Gemara says, "Bahai lo lichtov." Which one of the three of these candidates do you want to drop out and say will derive from the other two? Lo lichtov rachmana v'chatas chelev. If the Torah would have omitted any mention of lishma with regard to the chatas chelev, v'teisei mehanach, you derive it from a combination of nazir and mitzora. Ismail hanach shekain yeshim bam domim acheret. Right, a chatas of chelev is not accompanied by any other karbanos. Masha ein kain in the case of chatos nazir, the case of chatos mitzora. So now let's try another possibility. Lo lichtov rachmana bechatos nazir. Let's drop chatos nazir v'teisi mehanach, and we'll derive chatos nazir from a combination of tzadashav of chatos chelev and chatos mitzora. And we can't do that either because malhanach shekain ein lo hem she'ela. Interesting. The kula that applies only in the case of a nazir is that a nazir is midin hafla, which means midin neder, and the carbon is not an absolute requirement in all cases because all the nazir has to do is get in front of a chacham and be shol on his nazir, shol on his neder. So the carbon itself is an iffy kind of proposition. He might, and he has the power to do so, the nazir to be shol on his nazirus, which is certainly not the case in Taras Mitzora or in Chelev that he ate b'shogeg. So then we have only one other possibility. Lo lichtov rachmana v'chatas Mitzora. Can we derive chatas Mitzora from the other two? And we have here a special halach in chatas Mitzora. Now, I'm anticipating, but I'm going to be in deep trouble here, that the special halach in chatas Mitzora is going to make the chatas Mitzora more chamur than the others. But that's not how it works. V'teisei mehanoch, can we derive chatas mitzora from chatas chelev and chatas nazir? Malahalach shekein ein boim b'dalus. I don't get it. You know, the mitzora can decide, depending on his financial situation, whether he brings shnei torim b'nei Yonah and he gets away cheap, or he brings an animal. Oh, I see it. Just 1 second. I think now I have it. Let me just go over it one more time. Right. We're looking for a kula because we're postulating a carbon in, let's say, for example, in the case of nazir, we can't derive nazir from regular chatos or mitzvah because nazir has a kula sheken yeshna b'sheila. He can just completely annul his nazirs, and he doesn't have to bring the carbon. And what's the kula mitzvah? The kula mitzvah is that if he can't afford an animal, we'll let him bring 2 doves and pigeons. So at this point, we're still stuck with the problem of how do we derive all these chatos. Elamar Kra Zos HaTorah. Oh, we always come back to the same pasuk, which is where in Vayikra Perek Zayin we sing it in the piyut. Zos HaTorah li'ol mincha and li'osham lechatas li'osham and so forth and so on. Hikisha kosev l'shlamim, and at the end of the pasuk, I have it here in the Torah or it says. So all these types of karbanos are compared to the ultimate shlomim. And what does that teach me? Hikisha kosev l'shlomim, right? Chatos is on the list, so it gets compared by analogy to chu shlomim, mashlomim, bein shinui kodesh, bein shinui bailan be'ino l'shmolim mitzvah. Just like in the case of shlomim, although it doesn't passel the korban, but le mitzvah we require that he has in mind that korban, meaning that shlomim, and that he has in mind the bailim who are bringing that shlomim, is af chatos, even chatos, which is being compared to shlomim in this pasuk of Vizos HaTorah, is chatos bein shinin kodesh bein shinin bailim be'inu l'shmona le mitzvah. Okay, fine, that's only le mitzvah, hilka le mitzvah l'shlomim. So now, once we have a pasuk for the mitzvah in all chatos, then the other psukim in each one of the separate categories becomes shina kosev li'kuva to teach me that it passes the carbon. Ashkan chatos chelev. The Gemara says that we know that in the case of chelev, it's got to be ksiv bei lichatos. Okay, that's a pasuk in Vayikra Dalid, pasuk Lamed Gimel, and we know from there that the shchita of the carbon chatas, the classic carbon chatas, has to be done lishma.